Hey witches, Tiffany here on Bewitching Bemused. Today we're going to talk about some of the misconceptions that I had about witchcraft when I began my journey. Hey guys, so I recorded this entire video and deleted the script off of my laptop, only to realize what a hot mess the framing was. So I apologize for that. You'll notice that my chin is cut out of a good chunk of the video. I'll probably have to play with it a little bit in editing to make sure it's not just my giant head on the entirety of your screen. I'm really sorry about that. Forgive me. This was a video request that I got from somebody who did ask to remain anonymous, so I'm going to honor that, but I will read off what they wrote in their email. Can you talk about misconceptions you had as a baby witch? I think this would be helpful for those of us just starting out, but I'm also curious about your perspective and experience. I realize that there are kind of a lot of ways that I could answer this. I could talk about common misconceptions, right? But the viewer did specifically request for my personal misconceptions. I think a lot of them are very common anyway, so I'm gonna go that route. Unlike a lot of people, I did not come to witchcraft or paganism with the baggage of a previous religion. I was raised very loosely as a Christian, but it wasn't something that my family observed very strictly. We never went to church, so it was never really a big aspect of my life, and it wasn't a big part of the framework of my personal, metaphysical, and religious beliefs during my upbringing. I think that's partly why some of my misconceptions about witchcraft and paganism in the beginnings of my practice are very different from other people's. I did have a few instances where reading, a blogger who was very misinformed kind of scared me a little, but it wasn't something that, fear was not something that really clung to me as I started to explore my practice and start on this journey, but I know that is an issue for a lot of people. I will say though, just sort of as a catch-all before I get into my personal misconceptions, as a catch-all for people who did come into witchcraft or are coming into witchcraft and or paganism with that baggage of another religion, and also just as a catch-all to cover common misconceptions, I want to say magic is not inherently evil, it is neutral. It also does not involve working with the devil unless, of course, you want to. The vast majority of magic practitioners do not perform ritual sacrifice of other living beings, and anyone can consider themselves a witch or a magical practitioner so long as they have the desire and they devote the time and energy to it. It doesn't matter if you are male, female, trans, non-binary, or gender non-conforming. If you feel the call and you put the work in, you're a witch. Or whatever magical practitioner term you prefer. Okay, so now here are my personal misconceptions. If you haven't seen any of the videos where I talk about this, I started dabbling in witchcraft from the age of 12 and kind of on and off until I fully committed to my journey as a pagan and as a magical practitioner in my 20s. So some of these are going to be misconceptions I had when I was 12, some of them will be when I was 16, and some will be when I was 26. So we've got a bit of variety from different stages of my life here. So number one, magic will do all of the work for you. While even at the age of 12, I was well aware that creating magic in the real world is not the same as movie magic. I was aware I wouldn't just recite an incantation and poof, whatever I wanted would manifest. I still had this idea that magic could do all of the work for me. The truth is, magic and the mundane go hand in hand. If you do a job spell, but you don't do the work of actually applying for jobs, or at least have your resume posted somewhere like on LinkedIn or Indeed, or you're not out networking within your industry, most likely you're not going to receive a random cold call from a manager who wants to hire you. If you do a spell to increase your skill in something, but you never actually practice that skill in real life, you're not going to see results. Sometimes the split required between magical and mundane is 50-50, and sometimes it's 90-10 going in either direction. That's going to completely depend on the circumstances and what you are trying to manifest, but the universe always needs some sort of open path to get you what you are trying to manifest. Number two, you need to buy every tool. This is false. Please save your money. First of all, in the very beginning, but also all the way through your entire practice, there are plenty of random household items that will work to get the job done, and you can also make things yourself. There are plenty of ways to be a thrifty practitioner. You'll also find as you progress along your journey and you experiment with different things that certain tools will become completely obsolete for you over time. You aren't going to have a spell backfire or fail or be any less of a witch just because you don't have the cauldron and the athame and 40 different types of incense and the altar and the wand and the sword. If you go all out and you buy all of that stuff in one go, you're gonna regret spending some of that money later on. Number 3, personal preference rules need to be adhered to. Many things that have come to be known as rules are actually some author's personal preference that over time got repeated so many times that it seems to be set in stone. One example of this is that the right hand is always used for sending energy and the left hand is always used for absorbing energy. I use both hands for both tasks, but also, yes, I'm a right-handed person, but if my left hand was dominant, I would probably use this a lot more for sending energy, holding a wand, any instrument that you use to send energy, as opposed to my right hand. I also have yet to find a reason for this rule. And okay, if anybody actually knows of a reason, please put it in the comments. If you can cite a source, awesome. But even if it's just something that somebody told you at one point in time, I would love to hear it. I'm very curious about this actually, because it was this rule that I thought was, just absolutely set in stone. We must have gotten it from the ancient pagans, only to figure out this doesn't really work for me. That's just one example of a personal preference, but other ones are that you have to have a witch name, or you have to be in a coven, or you have to have a patron deity, which is something I'll touch on in a minute. The reality is, if you're cool with your own name, why make up another one? If you just prefer solitary practice, you don't have a need for a coven. Those are just a few examples, and don't get me wrong, sometimes something started as a personal preference, and now we have decades upon decades of tradition behind it. But at the end of the day, unless you can find a very clear explanation of why something needs to be done the way it's being told to you, just know that you can fiddle with it a little bit. You don't have to stick to it 100%, especially if it just doesn't feel right to you. But unless you can find a verifiable explanation of why a certain thing needs to absolutely be done a certain way, just know there might be tradition behind it, but it doesn't mean it's the only way to do it. So if intuitively it doesn't really work for you, don't worry, you can mix it up. Something very similar is number 4. Wiccan rules and customs are pagan and witchcraft rules and customs. This comes from way back when I didn't really know what the difference was between Wicca and paganism. Now, Wicca is obviously very popular, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I'm not a Wiccan, but when I started on my journey, Wicca is what I was exploring, and I have found that a lot of Wiccan customs have sort of kept their place in my own practice and in my own journey because they just sort of worked for me. In your research, especially early in, I'm sure that you found as well that there are a lot of overlaps, which makes sense. Wicca does fall under the paganism umbrella, but that's just the thing. Wicca falls under the paganism umbrella. Paganism does not fall under the Wiccan umbrella. Wicca was founded around the same time as the resurgence of witchcraft, and it totally makes sense. It was a huge part of the movement, and I'm absolutely going to give Wicca and its founders credit for that. But at the same time, due to that reasoning, Wiccan traditions over time have been sort of absorbed into other pagan and other witchcraft practices. And again, not really a bad thing. Sharing is caring, but there's a lot of misconception that all witches or all pagans follow certain Wiccan customs or rules, such as the threefold law. Because there just seems to be a lot of people that don't know or don't acknowledge that the threefold law is specifically Wiccan. It's not pagan and it's not witchcraftian. It's okay to not be a Wiccan and have certain overlaps with your practice and the Wiccan practice, But Wicca is not the be-all end-all when it comes to paganism or when it comes to magical practices. Number 5, spells need to come from a professional or author, or need to be done exactly as described. Now, to be fair, this can depend on the model of magic you are using. For instance, if you are performing an invocation from the Lesser Key of Solomon, yes, you do want to follow those instructions as they're laid out. In most cases anyway, but ancient grimoires working with the spirit model are pretty specific. But in working with sympathetic magic, it's all about accurately symbolizing the situation and your will to you. If you find a spell that you really like, but one or a few of the ingredients don't quite make sense to you, you can swap them out for things that better represent what those things are supposed to represent. You can reword the incantation to suit your situation better. It's okay. This also sort of ties into number 2 of why you don't need to buy every tool. Now, I've already done 2 other videos talking about why I think it's important for you to find your own correspondences as opposed to just following a book or following a table of correspondences. So I'll just cut it at that, and I will link those down below in the description box.
Hey witches, I'm jumping in real fast to say that if you're enjoying this video, make sure to hit that thumbs up. It really helps me a lot. And if you're interested in more content, please check out my Patreon. The link for it is down below in the description box.
This leads me into my next point. Number 6, the bigger the better. When I first started, and especially when I first started actually writing my own spells, I used to think the bigger the better. I tried to make sure every spell was performed, during the right moon phase, on the right day of the week, at the right time. I would try to find room for herbs and incense and crystals and candles and color correspondences and runes and sigils and these ridiculously lengthy incantations. The reality is, picking the necessary amount of ingredients is sort of a balancing act. You do want to have enough to strongly represent the situation as well as your intention regarding the situation, your will, and enough to trigger that symbolism in your mind. But more is not always better. Sometimes when you're using just way too much, at best, you're wasting a lot of unnecessary ingredients and time, and at worst, you are completely distracting yourself with all of these arbitrary accessories. Always remember that your most potent ingredient is your focus. So if you lose focus because you can't remember what time you burned the sage and what time you dabbed the oil onto the crystal and then passed that over the flame 5 times, it's too much. And you probably just messed up your spell because you don't even remember what the number of times you passed over the flame was supposed to represent. So good luck trying to visualize the course of events you want to take place as you are working with these symbols. Number 7, every witch needs a patron deity. Like I said earlier, this ties back to number 3 of personal preference. There's nothing wrong with wanting to work with deity. There's nothing wrong with wanting to have a patron deity, but I always encourage people, take your time and do your research. If you can't decide on one, don't force it. You can always wait and see if a deity calls out to you. You can also worship a deity without actually requesting that they start a relationship with you and you make a commitment to them. Now, a relationship with a deity can bring about more benefits. Yes, it can sometimes. And for some people, it is much more fulfilling than just practicing without a deity. For some people, but it's really not for everyone. And I was years into my practice before I heard a call from a deity, and I was like, all right, let's check this out. Even now, while we do have a really good working relationship, I don't call on her all the time. So being without a deity is perfectly fine. Number 8, working with magic means you completely ignore science and fact. Nope. When it comes to my personal beliefs in magic and in my spirituality, none of it has been disproven. Now, to be fair, it also hasn't been proven using the scientific method and peer-reviewed trials and studies and blah, 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 blah. But it hasn't been discounted yet either. And believe me, I love a good scientific study that backs up my beliefs. Not only this, but I also truly believe that we are exploring an area that science just hasn't been able to tap into yet. It hasn't been able to discover yet. At best, the scientific community has just barely started to scratch the surface on even studying the metaphysical. To me, today's magic is tomorrow's science. Number 9, there's only one way to achieve mindfulness and focus, which is meditation. Oh, and there's only one way to meditate. Now, this might seem weird coming from me because I recommend meditation all the time, but hear me out. The purpose of meditation is simply mindfulness. It is to train the mind to be able to quickly and easily clear the mind of all distractions and focus. Be in the moment mentally and emotionally. So yes, this practice of meditation, it can be achieved by sitting down and closing your eyes and clearing your mind and focusing on nothing but your breath, letting thoughts, just pushing them away, letting them drift away, and do that for 20 minutes every day. Yes, that is one method, but it is not the only way to achieve those exact same results. To become a more mindful person, there are a lot more techniques. Consider guided meditation or moving meditation. There's also just finding times throughout your day on a daily basis to practice willful mindfulness. So eventually it just becomes second nature. I talk about this more in my video on meditating with a busy mind. I will link that down below. And finally, number 10. Somewhere out there exists either a person or a book that has all the answers and makes this whole witchcraft thing easy. I just have to find them or it. That would be amazing. Don't get me wrong, it would. But magical practice is a journey. Whether you are an eclectic or you found a tradition with a singular path that you want to stick to, you're going to need to read a lot of books and watch a lot of videos and listen to a lot of podcasts and get information from various sources and people. You will also need to practice various different techniques and methods and experiment and play. See what works for you, see what doesn't, see what you enjoy and what you don't. See what is exhausting and what is totally worth the effort. I'm an eclectic, so my resources are vast, but even if you follow a specific path or tradition, no two practitioners of that same tradition are going to be alike, and their practices and their journey and their methods are not going to look exactly alike. Their beliefs and methods might be similar, but not identical. What works for one person may or may not work for you. It's all just about trial and error. So no, you're not gonna find some ancient manuscript that has all of the answers. That would be great. I wish I had that, but it just doesn't exist. Even if that did exist, one of the beautiful things about witchcraft and about paganism is that there are no set rules and it is very, very personal. So honestly, it would be really cool to read that book, but at the end of the day, I don't know if it would have a huge impact on my practice. It's really just going to take time and effort to discover the answers that you want. And on top of that, if you ever meet someone who claims that they have all the answers, just calmly stop whatever it is that you're doing and run far, far away from that person. All right, witches, those are my 10 personal misconceptions that I had about witchcraft and paganism the multiple times that I started my journey. I would love to hear some of the misconceptions that you guys had, so please drop those in the comments below and let me know if you guys can relate to some of the misconceptions that I had. I look forward to talking to you all down in the comments. I'll see you next week. In the meantime, stay magical.